Um, I'm going to talk, as Colin said, about some of the main trends we're seeing in anti-Semitism worldwide at the moment. I'm going to be talking, relying to a certain extent on examples from the UK, but I think some of the things we're going to be talking about are of global relevance. Because in another way, in the way anti-Semitism works, the world is a small place, and what happens in one country often influences what happens in another. Anti-Semites around the world learn off each other. They take encouragement and inspiration from each other. And I'm going to show you some examples of how that is. I'm going to share my screen. Let me just start my presentation. And I'm going to start with, if I can just, here we go. I'm going to start with a social media image from the recent conflict in Israel and Gaza that I think really sums up what we've been facing. It's an Instagram post from an Instagram account called Free Palestine 1948. Right now, if we look at the date 1948, this is not an account calling for Israel to remove itself from the West Bank. This is an account that clearly treats all of Israel as occupied territory, and therefore Israel shouldn't exist. And it's put up a cartoon of an Israeli soldier pointing a gun at an Arab woman on the floor, looking in the mirror and seeing a Nazi soldier pointing a gun at clearly a Jewish prisoner. And the slogan is, "The irony of becoming what you once hated." Right now, this theme, this idea that Israel is comparable to Nazi Germany, that it behaves just as badly, it's just as evil, in fact, is something that is absolutely ubiquitous, absolutely common in anti-Israel propaganda. We saw it all over the kind of narratives online and on demonstrations during the recent conflict. I'm going to show you some more examples. This Instagram post, if you look towards the bottom right, got nearly 40,000 likes. Now, I can tell you from our experience in this country, it was all over social media feeds of teenagers, school kids, students. Lots and lots of Jewish teenagers for the first time saw their non-Jewish friends sharing content like this and had to find a way to deal with that challenge. Do they argue back? Do they ignore it? How do they deal with the fact that people who they thought were their friends have attitudes like this or are sharing things they don't really understand? How do you explain why they shouldn't be sharing it, and so on? It was quite shocking, I think, for certainly a lot of younger people in our communities who were going through this for the first time. And this kind of messaging, this equation of Israel and Nazi Germany, was everywhere during this conflict. These are pictures taken from protests in London during the recent conflict in May. And you'll see these are all homemade banners, homemade placards. All the people, these are not printed in by one of the organizers and handed out to the people on these demonstrations. This is a case of people at home with a blank piece of cardboard and a marker pen or a paintbrush, thinking to themselves, what's the most important thing I need to put on my placard for this demonstration? I've got one thing to say about what's happening in Israel and Gaza. What's the most important thing to say? And for so many people, this was the most important thing to say. This is a Holocaust. Israel is the new Nazi state. Netanyahu isn't just as bad as Hitler, surpasses Hitler. Right? And this was young people as well. You know, these are not hardened veteran Jew haters who are doing this. This is young people who've seen this narrative, who've picked it up on social media largely, and who just think this explains things. This is the most important thing to say. In Britain, these are people who've been through Holocaust education in schools. Holocaust education is mandatory in British secondary schools. So they've learned about the Holocaust. They know what it is. Maybe that's why they feel this is the most important, the most powerful message to make. But there's a lack of understanding, I think, of why the equation of Israel with Nazi Germany is so anti-Semitic, why it is so hurtful and so offensive. Now, as well as this equation of Israel with Nazi Germany, which is a very modern anti-Semitic narrative. Obviously, it's something that could only exist after the Second World War, after the creation of Israel. It's an equation that has really gained momentum in recent decades. We also saw, as we often do, older anti-Semitic images and anti-Semitic themes. So the picture on the left, again, these are from protests in the UK, but I'm guessing very similar things happened in lots of other countries. The one on the left is, again, the Nazi comparison. One Holocaust doesn't justify another, but you've got Netanyahu turned into a devil with horns, literally the old anti-Semitic idea that Jews have horns and the association with blood. And the one on the right, depicting Netanyahu and Boris Johnson as snakes. Now, anyone who's familiar with anti-Semitic imagery, especially from Nazi Germany, but also back into the 19th century, will be familiar with the idea of Jews being depicted as snakes. You know, some of the original prints of the original copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion showed a globe with a Jewish snake wrapped around it. This is a very old anti-Semitic imagery, and it reappeared on these very modern anti-Israel protests. And here's the final one from the protest, which really sums it up. This was a demonstration in central London, and it's a picture of Jesus carrying the cross with the word Palestinians written by him. Do not let them do the same thing today again. Right. So this is going back to the old, the original founding idea of anti-Semitism, really, the idea that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. But not only is it repeating that old anti-Semitic idea, it's connecting it to what Israel does today. So it's saying Israel does terrible things in the minds of this person because Israel is Jewish, because it has an innate Jewish character. And the reason Israel bombs Gaza is the same reason why the Jews killed Christ. And this is an eternal Jewish trait. And that's the idea of this kind of placard. And that's the idea of where you get this really extreme hatred of Israel meshing together with these old anti-Semitic, very traditional anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Semitic ideas. And we see it on demonstrations, like I've just seen. We see it online. These are more posts from the same Instagram account, but there are so many accounts, so many posts like this. This one saying that the British government is effectively controlled by Israel money. Israel funds the whole of the Tory party. The entire cabinet is Zionist. So it's that old anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about Jews using money to control politicians. Here's another one. Same account has moved from talking about Israel and about Zionism to global Zionists planned 9/11 to start wars for Israel's expansion, right? So just completely overt conspiracy theories, a million miles away from anything that you could even consider as normal, legitimate criticism of Israel and of Israeli policies. And the consequence of this is a chart of the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK during the conflict. So you look at the left-hand half of the chart covering the month from the 7th of April to the 8th to the 7th of May. And the incident figures are pretty constant and pretty low. It's, you know, a handful, single figures per day. And then from kind of the first week of May, you get this massive spike, this massive escalation. And in the month from the 8th of May to the 7th of June in the UK, we have more anti-Semitic incidents reported to CST than we'd ever had in any month-long period in all the decades that CST has been doing this work. Over 600 anti-Semitic incidents in 4 weeks. The most serious of which was a really nasty assault, a really violent assault on a rabbi in London who was thankfully the injuries he suffered were not serious enough to cause lasting injury, but certainly he spent some time in hospital afterwards. And thankfully, 2 people have been arrested and charged for the assault on him and will stand trial. But what we get is, what this picture shows us, what we saw during the conflict in Israel, is this three-way relationship between the incitement and the anti-Semitism you see on demonstrations and online, and then hate crime in the offline world, on the streets. And most of those 628 anti-Semitic incidents we recorded in the UK were offline. They were on the streets. And the single most common type was people shouting abuse at visibly Jewish people in the street. A random Jewish person is walking down the road, and a car or a person goes past them and shouts abuse at them. And the most common language of the abuse was related to Israel and Gaza. And usually it was people waving Palestinian flags or shouting Free Palestine as they go through Jewish neighborhoods and singling out Jewish people on the streets to shout abuse at. And so you get this connection. There's always this debate about what is anti-Semitic and what is anti-Israel, and where's the dividing line between the two. And I think that question, where's the dividing line between these two things, really oversimplifies the relationship between this really unusual and very extreme emotional reaction that Israel gets on the streets of our cities. The really unique way that the unique levels of hatred that it triggers, that no other kind of foreign policy issue triggers in our own countries, in Western countries. And so what that then has a connection to anti-Jewish hate. It's both represents it, it's anti-Semitism being expressed in different ways, but it also fuels it, it encourages it. It's not as simple as there's a dividing line between the two. What there is a relationship between. And whenever Israel has a conflict, that is why anti-Semitism surges in our own countries. Now, another reason I think why it surged this time around is we have had this pandemic. We have had lockdowns. People have been very frustrated. People have not been able to go out and do normal things. They've not been able to go out and be in crowds. And actually, certainly in the UK, political demonstrations are one of the ways in which people have been able to go out and be in a crowd and express themselves and get that emotional release. And so there have been lots of different demonstrations during the pandemic that have happened that have had bigger crowds than they might do and more emotionally charged than they might do. I mean, we even saw it during the recent football European Championships. I think the reaction to that was more than it would have been, just because it was a release. And so I think the pandemic played a role in the reason why the surge in anti-Semitism, especially on the demonstrations, was so much more than previously, because the pandemic has played a role also in generating its own anti-Semitic narratives, as we heard earlier. And I'm going to show you some examples of this, because there's three main narratives, three main anti-Semitic narratives that the pandemic has brought up. And I'm going to show you examples of them briefly. The first one is the idea that this is great because Jews are going to die, right? COVID-19, certainly in the UK and I think in other countries, hit the Jewish community pretty badly early on. And anti-Semites, and especially in kind of extremist networks, got really excited about this. This is an image that went around on far-right online platforms, spread amongst far-right networks quite early on in the pandemic. If you have the bug, give a hug, spread the flu to every Jew. And then at the bottom, you see it says Holocaust, right? And this is celebrating the idea that Jews are going to die from COVID-19. Now, this image was created by an American neo-Nazi who creates a lot of the kind of online art, online imagery that goes around online far-right networks. We saw it being spread in British online networks. I expect the far-right activists online in Australia would have done the same, because these images go around the world. The next narrative that COVID generated is the conspiracy theory that coronavirus was invented by Jews. If you see the large writing at the bottom right, it's not Chinese, it's the Jew flu. And then there's various other, along with the anti-Semitic caricature, there's various other slogans and phrases there, that it's never let a crisis go to waste. plausible deniability, for economic collapse. Right now, the conspiracy, and at the top, this again is from a far right account on a platform called Gab. World War III has begun. Right now, conspiracy theories about Jews being behind COVID-19 didn't depend on the idea that COVID-19 wasn't true. You could either argue it's all made up, it's all a hoax by Jews, or you could argue it's true, the Jews invented it and they're spreading it. But the conspiracy theory works the same way. And it's just an example of how anti-Semitic conspiracy theories will latch onto anything going on in the world and find a way to fit it into their worldview, that everything bad that happens in the world, Jews, Zionists, Israel, some combination of them, are behind it. And the third anti-Semitic narrative was the one that we heard earlier, connecting the virus to Israel, right? The idea that Israel is the equivalent of coronavirus. Now, of course, if you think this isn't just an insult, this has deeper meaning. Coronavirus is absolutely deadly. It's global. The whole world needs to marshal all of its efforts and resources to get rid of this virus. There's nothing good about coronavirus. It's not something to compromise with. So the same for Israel. Israel, the whole world needs to get rid of Israel. That's the message of this. And as we heard earlier, the slogan COVID-1948. And here it's not even Israel, it's the Star of David as the virus. So again, it comes back to Jews. And this is just an example of how anti-Semitism always adapts, right? This talk is about anti-Semitism in 2021. We could do the same talk every year and there will be new narratives, there'll be new images that pick up on anything going on in the world of significance, and especially anything negative, and twist it to give it an anti-Semitic perspective. So the language is always changing. One of the challenges for us as Jewish communities, I think, is, we recognize this and we pick it up as it's happening. The challenge is to make sure other people, especially government, police, other partners, are aware of this in real time and pick up on it in the way that, or as quickly as we do, so that people recognize when hate crimes are happening, when anti-Semitic discourses are spreading online, so that social media companies can pick them up, because there's always new language and new images through which these very old ideas are transmitted. Now, when we talk about old ideas, of course, the kind of the traditional type of anti-Semitism that people often always recognize, and maybe find it easiest to recognize, comes from the far right. And this year we've been talking about COVID, we've been talking about, and these conspiracy theories about COVID spread through these kind of online conspiracy networks that aren't particularly far right or far left. They're a mixture of the two. It's kind of a mixed up conspiracist worldview. It doesn't really fit a political ideology that is easily describable. And it's connected to all sorts of other conspiracy theories about vaccines and masks and lockdowns and so on. Then we've also been talking about the conflict in Gaza, and most of the anti-Semitism that triggered came from the extreme left, or came from within kind of radical elements within Muslim communities. Certainly that's how it worked in Britain. Again, not primarily from the far right, although the far right certainly got excited about it. But the far right is always there. And the anti-Semitism is absolutely core to far right ideology, and that never changes. I mean, this is just a selection, a handful of the thousands and thousands of anti-Semitic and violent images that spread on online networks, far right networks, on fringe social media sites like Gab and Telegram and 4chan and so on, where hardened neo-Nazis encourage each other towards violence and towards terrorism. And you'll see towards the bottom right an image of Brenton Tarrant is one of the many images that we see, one of the many heroes for this online network. There's also in the second row on the left, there's an image where it says Britain First. There's an image of far-right terrorists from Britain who murdered the Labour Member of Parliament, Joe Cox, 5 years ago. And there's various other anti-Semitic images in there. And this is just a tiny fraction of the kind of thing that circulates. And as you'll see, the imagery is very shocking. I apologize for the shocking nature of it, but it's very high quality. That's the other thing. It's very eye-catching, and it's very impactful. And it comes alongside anti-Semitic videos that again draw on much older images from Nazi Germany or from other kind of more traditional, older anti-Semitic themes. But the important thing to remember is behind the whole of the far right's worldview lies this core anti-Semitism and the racism of the far right, the anti-Muslim hatred, the anti-immigrant hatred, still sits on a foundation of believing there is a Jewish conspiracy behind this immigration, behind the reasons why there are communities of color in Western nations and so on. This whole great replacement idea that the white race is being threatened by a Jewish conspiracy. And this leads, as we've seen in our different countries around the world, to terrorism. These are two images of Robert Bowers, the neo-Nazi who murdered 11 people at the synagogue in Pittsburgh. And the slogan, the image, all Jews must die, very simple. And as we've seen, this terrorism is global. It doesn't just affect Jewish communities. It affects, these are 4 images. One, I'm sure you recognize, Christchurch Mosque on the top left. Bottom right, the synagogue in Halle in Germany. And the other 2 are synagogues in Pittsburgh and San Diego from the United States, where there have been these awful terrorist attacks coming from far right. And I think this is something that is fundamental to far right anti-Semitism that is not necessarily the same on the far left, is the level of violence, the level of violent hatred, and it's always there. And it's one of the features of anti-Semitism globally is the number of different directions it can come from. And I think this is something that is perhaps in this year is perhaps the lesson we need to take away from this, is in order to really deal with anti-Semitism in the round, to protect our communities, to find partners, to try and push back and reduce anti-Semitism in our societies, we can never do it just looking in one direction. Right? It's never enough just to look to the far right or to the far left or to radical jihadists or to other sources. And especially at the moment where the online world is a place where any boundaries that used to exist between these different extremes have really become blurred. In recent years, we had, I'm sure you were aware, we had ongoing, really significant problems of anti-Semitism in the British Labour Party under its previous leadership, under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And one of the things we would see quite often is far-right anti-Semitism, in not just ideas, but actual images and web links from far-right sources being spread in left-wing networks, left-wing Facebook groups, Labour-supporting Facebook groups, by people who agreed with these anti-Semitic ideas or who these anti-Semitic ideas appealed to, and either didn't notice or didn't care they were coming from far-right sources. There's this incredible blurring, and was especially in the conspiracy theory, conspiracy movement, which has grown so much under the pandemic. And so I think really and this is kind of my final point, and then we'll go to questions. This, I think, is the lesson or the reminder for this year is we have to be looking in all directions. And when we try and find solutions to anti-Semitism, we have to find solutions that don't just rely on dealing with one particular type or finding allies from one particular part of society, but can deal with anti-Semitism in the round and treat it as a kind of whole picture threat to society and to the fundamentals of democracy, really, and find allies on that basis. I'll finish talking at that point. As you've seen, I've finished showing you pictures, and I think we've got a few hands, so I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for that, Dave. Truly fascinating and unfortunately troubling information there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we do have plenty of time for question and answers. At the bottom of your page, you will see a reactions button inside Zoom. there is a raised hand feature inside. When you hit the reaction button, it will send a private silent message to me that you wish to ask Dave a question, and then we'll flip to you. So the first question for tonight goes to Dr. Svi Fleischer.
Hi, Dave. Thank you very much for your presentation. I guess my question is, this round of fighting between Israel and Hamas was not as long as last ones, and less people died than the last couple of wars we've had. But we saw a huge spike in anti-Semitic online and extreme anti-Israel behavior in public. Can you tell me why you think this time was so much worse? And more importantly, is this a trend that can be reversed, or is every conflict between Israel and Hamas, which there'll probably be future ones, going to get worse and worse?
It was more intense. I mean, you're absolutely right to point out that the actual conflict in Israel and Gaza was shorter, but the anti-Semitism it triggered was more intense. Now, I think there's a few reasons for this. And some of them are particular to what happened in the actual conflict. So because the conflict initially started around Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Temple Mount, it immediately brought in incredibly powerful emotions around these religious sites around the world. That if the conflict had only been restricted to Gaza, may not have necessarily played out in the same way. And we shouldn't underestimate, and certainly this is what we hear from our contacts in the Muslim community here in Britain, we shouldn't underestimate the religious dimension of the emotional significance and the power of that role, that emotional role, because of the religious sides. The second thing I think is about the role of social media. You know, social media now is very different from what it was during the last major conflict in Israel and Gaza, which was in 2014. You know, in 2014, the main social media platforms where a lot of the anti-Israel discourse circulated were Facebook and Twitter. And now it's Instagram and it's TikTok, right? They're image-based, and they reach younger people much more. And certainly what we were hearing, we had a massive problem here. I don't know if you had the same. We had a massive problem of anti-Semitism in schools, in secondary schools. In mainstream schools, not Jewish schools, but where there were Jewish kids and Jewish teachers, actually, who got a lot of anti-Semitic abuse from some of the kids. This social media component, driven by image-based content on image-based platforms and circulated globally by influencers, you know, there's much more of the whole culture, the whole phenomenon of social media influencers, whether they are celebrities, YouTubers, Hollywood stars, athletes, sports people, sharing this stuff, getting hundreds of thousands or millions of views, absolutely turbocharged what was going on online. And I think the third factor is I think the pandemic. I think that the fact the pandemic, I think, has just given a sharp edge to everyone's reactions to everything at the moment. Frankly, this is not the only issue where the public reactions, I think, are more extreme than they would have been. Both some positive things and some negative things, depending on the issue, more extreme than they would have been in normal times, when just there's lots of other things going on to distract people, and when people haven't been cooped up at home for so long. So I think those are the three factors, really.
Thanks, Dave. I'll now hand over to Josh Feldman for the next question.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for taking the time to chat to us. Obviously, for British Jews, you know, in recent years, one of the big issues when it comes to anti-Semitism has been from the left and from the Labour Party. So I was just wondering, when we look over to the US and the Democrats, do you see any similarities between, you know, what's happening with Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Cory Bush, and the like, and the Corbynisation of UK Labour? And if so, what kind of role do you think, you know, these progressive anti-Semitic ideas in America may have to play in the Democratic Party in the years to come?
Hi, Josh. I think it's a valid question. Obviously, the situation in America is they're never going to be exactly the same, because the societies are very different, the demographics are very different, the whole political context and environment, just even the structures of the parties are very different. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn took over the Labour Party largely because of the Labour Party is a very bureaucratic party, and he played the system. He knew how to work the system to actually become leader, and every party has a different internal structure, a different way of choosing its leadership. But I think there are lessons there that apply not just in Britain or America, but across the board. And these lessons are, these kind of radical left ideas that either incorporate anti-Semitism or create a space for a particular type of anti-Semitism, as happened in the UK. These ideas exist on the left in lots of countries, and mainstream left-wing parties, I think, are not necessarily that good at policing their leftmost border, if you like, at making sure that people and parties and ideas from the extreme left don't influence or shape the mainstream party. And I think that's one lesson. Another one is, in the social media age, and this sort of contradicts the first lesson, in the social media age, it's not enough just to control who's actually a member of your party or who holds this particular office or that particular office, because the ideas are shaped online. The internal discourse of a political party can be shaped by people who are not members of that party, but are in the same Facebook groups or the same Twitter networks and so on. And the third lesson, I think, is a political party, if a political extreme of left or right gets control or significant influence of a political party, they don't actually need to get power in order to do a lot of damage. Jeremy Corbyn in the end was not really ever that close to being prime minister, but nevertheless, by him and his followers taking over and being so influential in the Labour Party, it created a huge amount of damage in terms of anti-Semitism, not just in politics, but in society as a whole in Britain. And there's a legacy there we're still dealing with. So I do think there are things for the American Jewish community and the Democrats to pay attention to in terms of lessons to learn. But I think it's not just in Britain or America. I think it applies across the board.
Thanks, Dave. I've got a 12-year-old Mount Scopus student. Mount Scopus is one of our fantastic Jewish day schools here in Melbourne, and it's from Charlie Levy, and he's asking, what can he do about the violence and danger around anti-Semitism?
Hi, Charlie. I'm very happy you've joined us. It's a great question. The most important question, in a way, is what can we do about this? And I think the thing for you to do is certainly, I'm thinking about what's gone on in the UK and with teenagers and with kids your age. It's really important to know how to explain what anti-Semitism is, and to explain what Israel is and what it means for Jewish people that Israel is there. There is so much ignorance and so much misinformation goes around about Israel, about Zionism, about anti-Semitism. And it's really important that we, all of us, especially from a young age, we know our basic facts and that we're able to explain the reasons why these things matter to us. So I think that's kind of our starting point. We need to know ourselves and to then be able to make those arguments. I think in terms of like your specific question, in terms of dealing with the violence and so on, most anti-Semitism is not violent. I think this is a really important thing to remember, especially in schools. Most anti-Semitism is about ideas. And most people who express anti-Semitic ideas don't know that they are anti-Semitic, or certainly are not consciously anti-Jewish in their own minds. Right? There are lots of anti-Semitic ideas go around that we would all recognize as really offensive and terrible, but the people expressing them don't necessarily know that. So we have to first of all educate ourselves and then try and educate others. right? If we try and educate others and they're not interested and they're not listening, it turns out really they just don't like Jews. Okay, we've learned that about them, and then there's a different way of dealing with that. But I think, first of all, let's go for the education route, and let's see how many situations we can deal with that way.
Thank you for that, Dave, and thank you, Charlie, very much for your question and your engagement. I'd now like to hand over to Professor Suzanne Rutland.
Right, am I unmuted? Yeah,
You're all good.
My question is about campuses, because at the University of Sydney, our union passed a very anti-Israel motion, which was very emotive, of course, including words like apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and so on. So just from your British experience, did you find that this was very common on campuses, and what approaches have the UK leadership taken in that regard?
Campus is a big problem, and it's of course campuses have been a problem for this kind of anti-Semitism for a while. And what we're starting to see in the UK, and not just in the UK, I mean, I think you can see it in the States as well, is that the anti-Semitism is not just coming from students, it's increasingly coming from staff, from academic staff. We've had quite a few cases in the UK over the last few years of Jewish students complaining about anti-Semitic comments made by their own lecturers. We have an ongoing problem at the University of Bristol with a sociology professor there by the name of David Miller, whose whole academic output, his whole body of work, is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jewish or Zionist money causes global Islamophobia. So this is a problem. And what we saw during the recent conflict was in certain disciplines, particularly in humanities and social sciences, kind of loyalty statements that academics are being expected to sign. You know, that Israel, like you say, is an apartheid state. It shouldn't exist. All the rest of it, all the usual anti-Zionist narratives. But not only that, but that academics are signing these statements to display these beliefs are core to our academic identity. This is core to our scholarship. This is something that David Hirsch, who's a British academic you may well know, has written about. And this is about kind of, as he puts it, shaping the boundaries of the communities of the good, and anyone who doesn't want to sign these statements is kind of persona non grata. And of course, campuses are where these ideas are then shaped for the next generation as well. So it is a significant problem. It is something we're starting to turn our minds to in the UK. A lot of universities have adopted the AIJAC definition of anti-Semitism, which is an important step. But more important than adopting it is actually using it and learning how to apply it properly. And that's also becoming a challenge in the academic sector.
Thank you, Dave. I'd now like to hand over to the Honourable Walt C. Cord, MLC.
Thank you. And as a parliamentarian, I tell you that timing is everything. And today's post arrived, your book. So I'm looking forward to. I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm the deputy chair of the New South Wales Parliamentary Friends of Labour. I'm a state MP and the Shadow Minister for Police and Counterterrorism. But I have a very simple question, and it actually is a slight variation on Charlie's question. How do we actually respond? Some people say simply ignore the rantings on social media, but what is our response to all of the examples that you provided today? What should we do when we encounter them?
We can't ignore what's happening on social media. It's absolutely central to the anti-Semitism that was stirred up this time around, and it's becoming this idea that Israel just shouldn't exist. You know, it's a racist hangover from colonialism, and what is it doing there? And just it just doesn't fit with the modern world. this is an idea that that is so influential now amongst sort of high school, university student age. So we can't ignore it. We absolutely can't ignore it. Now, what to do about it? There's a few different things. Now, you can argue back against individual posts, right? But that has limited impact, to be honest. You know, if you're a young person and you're having that discussion with a friend, then that's fine. That's an opportunity to try and change an individual mind. But in terms of the bigger picture, more important is to change the whole direction of that narrative, and that is about having a better story to tell about Israel, about Israel's existence. It's not about getting into the detail of is this thing Israel did good, you know, right or wrong, good or bad. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the back and forth of normal political debate over any particular Israeli action or policy. I'm talking about this broad brush, you know, is there a space for Israel in the world? Right. And that is where I think we need to be thinking a much bigger picture. How do we tell that story? And how do we get that story to have a similar kind of impact? Right. To suck the energy out of this eliminationist fervor that wants to see Israel just wiped from the map. And I think that is a challenge. That is a global challenge. It's not something any of us can do in our individual communities, because these posts, this content is being spread by influencers tens of thousands of miles away and landing on the phones of our kids, best friends and classmates. And that's where we need to, you know, that's where it then impacts.
Thank you, Dave. We have time for a few more questions. I'll now hand over to Gus Lira.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dave. I was shocked to read, I think in something which Alan Dershowitz wrote, that roughly 25% of American Jewish students, not American students, but American Jewish students, believe that Israel is an imperialist outpost with apartheid policies. Now, this could partly be due to social pressures on students, and I know those pressures exist because I am also on the same campus as Suzanne Rutland, who asked you the earlier question about campuses. But my question to you is, do you think that this could be a sign that anti-Semitism is part of a much greater transformation of society, where the whole of Western society is questioning itself, where the fundamental concepts of freedom and democracy are under challenge for the first time, supported both by the extreme right and by Muslims who believe that democracy is not for them, and in particular the trio of things that go with that line of thinking: identity politics, where it matters more who you are than what you do, the cult of victimhood, and diversity and inclusion, which in my own experience has meant, I've seen this at the very highest echelons of our society, not only in Australia, but also in the UK, where diversity and inclusion basically signals the rise of the oppressed. In other words, it's sort of the demise of meritocracy.
Well, I think, look, I know the statistic you're referring to. I think there was a recent opinion poll that showed 25% of Jewish students, or even just American Jews, I can't remember the exact details, believe Israel is an apartheid state. Look, what I think is going on here, I do wonder if that figure is specific to America, actually. I wonder if you get the same figure in other communities. But anyway.
Well, there are a lot of Jews who argue on that side.
Let me answer your broader point, right? Does this reflect broader changes, much deeper, more profound changes in society? I think what it may reflect is, over the last year and a bit, many countries have gone through a process of reevaluation and self-reflection about racism in our societies, right? Because after the killing of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, certainly this happened in the UK, of course in the US more than anywhere, and I suspect elsewhere as well. And this was a long overdue and very important process of self-reflection, I think, about racism in our societies. But one of the things it's done is it has persuaded a lot of people that racism is the way to understand everything, right? That every problem, every conflict, every phenomenon, that's the framework, right? The issues of racism in our societies are actually incredibly complex, but a lot of people will end up just veering towards a simplicity. And so then you have the conflict in Israel and Gaza, right? And the whole anti-Zionist narrative being pumped out is, this is not a conflict. This is colonialism. This is racism. This is the white oppressor and the oppressed people of color, right? That's the way to understand the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I think that narrative was more appealing and just made more sense to more people now than it would have done a few years ago, because many more people, and especially younger people, are more likely to interpret and understand a lot of society's problems, a lot of the world's problems, through this framework of race and racism than would have been the case a couple of years ago. And I suspect that may be it being what is being reflected in that opinion poll. This is partly speculative on my part. This is just a theory of mine, but I suspect that is what is going on. And that is why, because the whole anti-colonial narrative about Israel, I think, got a lot more purchase during the recent conflict than it has done during previous ones. And I suspect this is part of the reason as to why.
Thank you, Dave. Now, we are running a little short on time. We'll see how many questions we can get through, but if we can't get to everyone, my apologies. I'll now hand over to John Ziegler.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Dave. That's been fantastic. Very, very insightful. Some of my questions have already been asked and answered very well. I just wondered whether there's a sort of glimmer of hope in the Jeremy Corbyn saga. He, unlike the American Democrat representatives, he seemed to try very hard to deny that anti-Semitism was playing a part in his policies, pronouncements, activities. Would you agree that that's correct? That he tried to downplay it? Yeah. So does that mean that he realized it was bad, or did he just think it was bad politics? And either way, is there some hope in that fact?
Look, Jeremy Corbyn is a veteran campaigner of the left whose entire, he's been Member of Parliament since 1983. His entire self-identity is that he is anti-racist and anti-discrimination. The whole idea that he might be anti-Semitic was personally so hurtful to him and so contrary to his idea of himself and his own politics that he just couldn't compute, right? And he just thought it was all a smear. It had to be a smear because he can't be anti-Semitic because he's Jeremy Corbyn, the anti-racist. And that applies across the board for lots of people on the left. Actually, is an assumption that because they're left wing, they're anti-racist, therefore they can't possibly be anti-Semitic. Therefore, any claim that they are anti-Semitic is a Zionist smear campaign. I mean, it literally went in that, right? So no, I don't think it's encouraging. I think it's the opposite of encouraging, because there was a complete inability to actually self-reflect, to actually be objective and take a step back and actually listen and try and understand. Now, what it also meant is he had a long record of anti-Semitic activity and statements and associations going back a long time. That isn't necessarily the case with the comparable figures or the people he often gets compared to in the Democrats in America, who tend to be younger and kind of much more exciting as politicians and as people. And this is the other lesson that I think we take away is this kind of radical left-wing analysis and radical left-wing movement. This is where the energy is on the left at the moment. You know, Corbyn took over because the mainstream of the Labour Party was just so tired and had its day, and there was just nothing that appealing about it. This is where the excitement is. It's where the energy is. You know, it's where it's just what appeals. It's just, you know, it's where the fun is. And when you get, you know, the left, if the broad church of the left extends that far left, the mainstream always tends to get dragged along by the more radical elements because they're more exciting, basically. And I think I suspect that's what's happening and certainly what could happen in the States.
Thank you, Dave. Now, before we wrap up, I am going to apologise to both Anthony Cohen and Aaron Shapiro. We have run out of time for your questions, but we will get them and look forward to them on the next webinar. I'll now hand over, before I hand over to Jeremy Jones for the final question, I'll quickly hand over to Colin Rubenstein.
Hey, thanks very much for a wonderful presentation. You're right, these problems are very much global. I'd just like to direct your attention to the state's sponsorship by anti-Semitic regimes in this ugly trend. Recent studies showed that the Iranian regime linked Twitter accounts began spreading messages like Hitler was right, kill all Jews at the rate of 170 times per minute during the recent Israel-Hamas war. And similarly, of course, we've seen the role and significance of apparent troll factories in Malaysia as well, in terms of the recent flare-up of anti-Semitism. How significant is all of this, and what do we do about it?
Look, it's definitely a feature. We've seen that in the UK as well, with Iranian-linked Twitter accounts stirring up anti-Semitism, and even going back further during the Brexit campaign, the most active Russian bot account actively tweeting for Brexit during that campaign was an account called Israel Bombs Babies that also tweeted lots of anti-Semitism. However, I think these accounts tend to stir up what is already there rather than create it from whole cloth. I think the problem of anti-Semitism in our societies is predominantly exactly that, a problem of anti-Semitism in our societies, rather than something artificial that is injected into our societies by these external accounts. So I think it's definitely a phenomenon, and the fact that there are countries that have worked out that this is a way to another issue to play on to divide Western societies is something that governments need to look at and deal with. But I don't think it's the main game in town. I really don't. I don't think it's the primary source.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Colin, for the question. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for the final question for this evening, I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Jeremy Jones.
Hello, Dave. It's good to see you. That very depressing topic, and thank you so much. I recall it's 20 years ago next month since the Durban World Conference Against Racism, the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in Durban. At that conference, many Jewish organizations and people opposed to anti-Semitism were shocked by the simple conclusion that there was no cost to being anti-Semitic. There was a cost to standing up against anti-Semitism in that context. So for 20 years, people in the Jewish community have been trying to find ways where we can claw back or make sure that we have a different template in future. Last week in Canada, the Canadian government and others had a national summit which was the Canadian government and others trying to plan the best way to respond to anti-Semitism with the premise that Canada would not accept anti-Semitism as being acceptable in any form. My question, and the question that's come to us in many emails and messages as we're preparing for tonight and tonight, is what are governments and others who are fighting anti-Semitism doing correct? What are we doing right? So where should we be putting our energy in the short term? Which areas should we be putting in our energy in the short term so we can get the best possible result to deal with the terrible problems?
Thank you. It's lovely to see you too, Jeremy. I have to say, normally when I'm at any sort of meeting or conference with Jeremy, I get a little furry kangaroo to bring home. That's one of the downsides of doing this on Zoom. Look, you're absolutely right. We need to make sure there's a cost to anti-Semitism. That is absolutely crucial. There has to be a cost, whether that is the hate crime offender getting arrested and getting, prosecuted, or whether it is the social media offender getting banned from social media, or whether it's the person expressing ideas just getting ostracized professionally or socially. There needs to be a cost. Now, what can governments do about this? There's things governments can do, but there's also a limit to what they can do. Governments can make sure that there is appropriate legislation in place to deal with hate crimes. They can make sure that Jewish communities have funding for security. They can make sure that anti-Semitism is investigated properly, and the anti-Semitic terrorist groups are investigated properly. They can also show leadership, right? Let's not underestimate the power of leadership. The situation in the British Labour Party is completely different now from what it was under Jeremy Corbyn, and that is because of the new leadership has changed. But beyond that, it's not just governments that need to do something. We need changes in society and in civil society, and governments can only go so far in all of this, because there are, especially when we talk about anti-Semitism of the sort we saw during the Gaza conflict, that come from elements of the radical left and so on. These are not parts of society that necessarily listen to governments, especially if it's a conservative government, as we have in Britain at the moment. So there's other forms of leadership we need in society, especially from those bodies that are traditionally anti-racist and anti-discrimination, whether that is trade unions, whether it's churches and religious leaders, whether it's other kind of opinion formers and so on, to basically make sure anti-Semitism is socially unacceptable, and that there is, like I say, there is a cost, even if it's an informal cost, that people suffer for expressing these views. But my final point, what can governments do? Regulate the internet. If I had one policy ask of every government, every democratic Western government, let's put it that way, introduce proper regulation of the internet and social media, so that social media companies have to actually not only do the things that they currently claim to do, but actually do a lot more than that to stop hate online.
Thank you very much, Dave, for the fascinating presentation, and thank you for being able to jump on board at that time as well. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we wanted to thank you for your participation tonight. After a bit of a rocky start, we certainly got there. Please be on the lookout in your inboxes for the next webinar invitation. On behalf of AIJAC and the team at AIJAC, thank you, Dave, so much for the presentation tonight. I'm sure a lot of people gained a lot from it. And if you would like to see a replay of this video or send it to your friends, it will be up on our YouTube channel tomorrow. It will also be up on our Facebook page as soon as this webinar ends. And on that note, we look forward to seeing you for the next episode of AIJAC Live Online. It's bye for now.